Okay, it's 7 p.m. I'm Ryan Bubb. I'll be filling in for Don Ellington this evening for your Newark City Council meeting. To my left is Autumn Klein, the Clerk of Council. If you'll call the roll, please.
Mr. Fennell?
Here.
Mr. Frazier?
Here.
Ms. Hall?
Here.
Mr. Labutus?
Here.
Mr. Lang?
Here.
Mr. Marmee? Mr. Rath?
Here.
Mr. Blake?
Here.
Mr. Bubb?
Here.
And Mr. Cost?
Here.
Okay, we will move on to the invocation tonight, which will be led by Councilman Blake, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance, which will be led by Laura Canby. If you lead us in the pledge. Mr. Blake, go ahead.
May you bow your heads. Heavenly Father, we welcome you into this space. Guide us with your wisdom. Guide us with the strength to lead. Lord, give us the patience to have open ears to listen and open minds to understand. We ask these things, and we give you the praise and glory. Amen.
Amen.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, we will move on to caucus this evening. Does anyone have anything for caucus?
I'd like to excuse Mr. Marmee and Mr. Ellington.
Okay, I have a motion by Mr. Frazier to excuse Mr. Ellington and Mr. Marmee. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Lang. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed. We will move on to the minutes of March 19th, 2018. Do I have a motion to accept the minutes?
Motion.
Motion by Frazier, second by Rath. All those in favor can signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, we will move on to reports of standing committees. Have a report from Finance and Safety. Without objection, those will be received and filed. Moving on to citizens' comments. We'll have our citizens' comments now and after the legislation. If you would like to speak your opinion, you are welcome to come up to the podium. If you would state your name and address for the record, you may proceed. Do we have anyone? See none, we will move on to legislation ordinances on the second reading. The first ordinance is 18-04. Ford, clerk, if you will read the ordinance.
Ordinance 18-04 by Mr. Cost, an ordinance amending Chapter 454 and Chapter 407 of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Newark, Ohio regarding the regulation of parking vehicles in the downtown area.
Okay. Do we have any discussion on the second reading of ordinance 18-04?
Mr. Bubb, this just updates the to our parking zones, free parking zones in downtown Newark. We had passed legislation previously that extends it on 3rd Street and 4th Street from Church Street to Locust Street to Wall Street. So just updates that.
Okay. And we need a motion.
Motion.
Okay.
I'd like to make a motion to
Okay.
adopt.
Okay, got a motion by Labutus, second by Cost. Any further comments or questions? Clerk, you can call the roll, please.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee? Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bubb?
I do not believe I voted this evening.
Yes, you do.
I
Okay.
still do vote. Okay. Yes.
And Mr. Cost?
Yes.
Okay. Motion passes 8-0. We will move on to ordinances on the first reading.
Ordinance 18-05 by Mr. Frazier and Mr. Cost. An ordinance to provide for the issuance of not to exceed $1,125,000 of bond anticipation notes in anticipation of the issuance of bonds for the purpose of paying the cost of Church Street area improvements and repair, including electrical, sidewalk, street, and streetscape, and all necessary appurtenances thereto, and declaring an emergency.
Okay, you have heard ordinance 18-05.
Mr. President,
Mr. Blake.
move to adopt 18-05.
Second.
Okay, I have a motion by Councilman Blake, a second by Councilman Frazier. For 18-05, any questions or comments regarding this? Seeing none, clerk, you can call the roll.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee? Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
And Mr. Cost?
Yes.
Ordinance passes 9-0, and for clarification on the ordinance on 18-04, that vote was 9-0. I misspoke and said 8-0. Move on to ordinance 18-06.
Ordinance 18-06 by Mr. Cost and Mr. Frazier, an ordinance to provide for the issuance of not to exceed $2 million of bond anticipation notes in anticipation of the issuance of bonds for the purpose of paying the cost of Buckeye Corridor stormwater planned sewer improvements and all necessary appurtenances thereto, and declaring an emergency.
You have heard ordinance 18-06.
Mr. President,
Councilman Blake.
move to adopt 1806.
Second.
Motion on the floor to adopt 18-06 by Councilman Blake, second by Councilman Frazier. Anyone have any questions or comments regarding this? Seeing none, clerk, you can call the roll.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee? Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
And Mr. Cox?
Yes.
Motion passes 9-0. We will move on to ordinance 18-07.
Ordinance 18-07 by Mr. Cost and Mr. Frazier, an ordinance to provide for the issuance of not to exceed $1 million of bond anticipation notes in anticipation of the issuance of bonds for the purpose of paying the cost of water system improvements and all necessary appurtenances thereto, and declaring an emergency.
You have heard ordinance 18-0,
Mr. President,
18-07, I'm sorry. Councilman Blake.
move to adopt 18-07.
Second.
Motion on the floor by Blake, second by Frazier. Questions or comments regarding this? Seeing none, clerk, you can call the roll.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee? Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
And Mr. Cox?
Yes.
Motion passes 9-0. We will move on to ordinance 18-08.
Ordinance 18-08 by Mr. Cost and Mr. Frazier, an ordinance consolidating the two bond anticipation note issues of the city of Newark, Newark, Ohio, and declaring an emergency.
You've heard ordinance 18-08.
Mr. President,
Mr. Blake.
move to adopt 18-08.
Second.
Motion on the floor to adopt 18-08 by Blake, second by Frazier. Does anyone have any questions or comments regarding this? Seeing none, clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee? Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
And Mr. Cox?
Yes.
Motion passes 9-0. We will move on to resolutions on the first reading.
Resolution 18-22 by Mr. Cost, a resolution appropriating monies for the current expenses of the municipal corporation.
You've heard the resolution, or 18-22.
Mr. President,
Mr. Blake.
move to waive the 2-day reading rule.
Second.
Motion to waive the 2-day reading rule on 18-22 by Blake, second by Frazier. Clerk, you can call the roll.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee? Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
And Mr. Cox?
Yes.
2-day reading rule has been waived. Mr. Blake.
Mr. President, we have there's a TIF refund in here. It's a reason for this to be expedited. Move to adopt 18-22.
Second.
Motion by Blake, second by Frazier. Further questions, comments regarding this matter? Seeing none, clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee? Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
And Mr. Cox?
Yes.
Motion passes 9-0. Moving on to Resolution 18-23.
Resolution 18-23 by Mr. Cost, a resolution authorizing and directing the mayor of the city of Newark to apply for financial support from the state of Ohio 2018 Nature Works grant.
Resolution 18-23 will be held for a second reading. Finally, this evening, Resolution 18-24.
Resolution 18-24 by Mr. Cost, a resolution appropriating and disappropriating monies for the current expenses of municipal corporation.
Resolution 1824 will be held for a second reading. That concludes our legislation for this evening. This will bring us to the second round of comments from citizens. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to speak this evening? If so, if you come forth and state your name and address. Seeing none, we will move on to the city administration. Is there anyone from the city administration that has anything tonight? Auditor Johnson.
I think you're on a record-setting pace here tonight, so I'll throw it off the net.
Law Director Sassen.
I'll pass, thank you.
Mayor Hall.
I will pass this evening also.
Okay. We'll move on to comments from council representatives. First, councilperson be Mr. Sean Fennell. Do you have anything to say? Okay. Moving on to Mr. Mark Frazier.
Mr. Bub, thank you so much. Great job tonight.
Thank you.
So 4/4, there's an HHCA weekly meeting, as well as 4/21 is the HHCA cleanup, as well as a transit meeting, and I will leave it there to continue the record pace. With that, I'll pass.
Ms. Hall?
I will pass, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Lapides?
I will pass this evening.
Okay. Mr. Lang?
So I'd like to start, first I'd like to publicly thank Chief Connor and Chief Connell for taking time to meet with me, along with Deputy Chief McKee and Deputy Chief Logan from the MPD. Just getting a good sense of what our safety forces have been up to, what the challenges are with their departments. We're really blessed with some great leadership, and learned a tremendous amount about the challenges they face by meeting with them. I also recently had the pleasure of attending the March for Our Lives last Saturday on the square here in Newark, and I went because I wanted to hear what the kids had to say, what our young folks had to say, and show them it's important that our elected officials show them that we're listening, to teach them to stand up for what they believe, and that we as public servants should make a point to recognize them and hear them when they stand up. So, Mr. Fennell, I thought it was great introducing the girl from Licking Valley. I'm not sure I agree with teaching our children that there's should be no consequences for their actions. Civil disobedience has been and will continue to be an important part of free speech, but the power of civil disobedience comes from the willingness to accept the consequences of those actions. But the young people overall, I think, were really inspiring. I disagree with some of their solutions to the problem, but I wholeheartedly agree we have a serious problem with school safety in our community, and we really need to be focused on that from all levels of government. I was encouraged by several of the young people who spoke with great depth and a really great understanding about the complexity of the issue, and that it's more than just banning guns. There's so much more to the problem. Some of the kids were divisive and partisan in their approach, but honestly, most of these kids were actually more practical and holistic than I know I certainly would have been at their age. And so I really want to commend them for the way that they spoke and the eloquence with which they spoke. After the young folks spoke, the event turned, and all the adults running for office gave different versions of, hey, weren't those kids great? Followed by, hey, here's why you should vote that means you should vote for me. And the rally, I thought, really should have been more about the kids, a moment for them to speak and for us to listen. And we could have done that without making the adults, making it about the adults running for office. And I'm not saying that because I disagree, or I'm a different party than those candidates. But at the end of the day, neither party really has a monopoly on caring about the safety of our kids. I've got kids, and as a parent, it really sickens me to think that my kids are going to be participating in active shooter drills. But regardless of political affiliation, I think it's been my experience that all parents care about the safety of their kids. And we may disagree on how we get that goal, achieve that goal. But all in all, I was really inspired by the courage of the kids, and I'm proud to live in a community where we teach our youth to be confident, confident enough to stand up for themselves, and we give them the opportunity to speak up. So with that, I'll pass.
Thank you, Mr. Lang. Mr. Rath.
Thank you. Along that same note, I read an article in The Advocate about Newark City schools and the things that they've done to address the safety issue in our school systems. And I just want to commend Newark City schools. They've done an awful lot within the school system. I'm going to list off everything that they've done, but they are leaders in some respects, followers in others, but they've done an awful lot to address this issue. And I just wanted to commend them at their efforts at that. With that, I'll pass.
Thank you. Mr. Blake?
Oh, I'm sorry. Could I just say, call service committee meeting for 2 weeks from now. Thank you.
Mr. Blake?
No, I'll pass.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to call a finance committee meeting for the 2-week period. Also want to announce that the many of our canine unit dogs are getting retired, and there's a fundraiser for them at the Licking County Humane Society that's going to benefit the Newark Police Canine Unit, and that's going to be on May 17th at 8 p.m. And so tickets are going to go for $20 a piece, and so that event's going to be happening to replace the canine units, the dogs that are going to be servicing with our officers. So just put that on your calendars. And with that, I'll pass.
Thank you. Mr. Cost?
I will pass, thank you.
Thank you. A couple housekeeping items this evening. I guess just one. Our next meeting will be April 16th, starting at 5:45. We'll have finance service at 7 p.m. We will have a council meeting. That being said, is there a motion to adjourn?
Second.
Motion by Cost, second by Frazier. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
This meeting's adjourned.